At 79, Diane Keaton departed this world, leaving behind something far greater than cinematic achievements and celebrity status. She bequeathed a timeless heritage of authenticity, joy, and inspiration. As reported by People, the cherished actress died in California on October 11, 2025, enveloped by a global community that valued her genuine spirit as deeply as her artistic contributions. Yet, as heartfelt messages flooded in, one name resonated with particular intensity: Al Pacino. For years, their relationship had unfolded away from the glare of Hollywood's spotlight, a profound connection that originated on the set of The Godfather and, in many ways, never truly faded. When word of her death reached him, the man so often defined by his quiet intensity finally broke his silence, and in a handful of emotional, unsteady words, he unveiled a reality that had waited decades to be spoken aloud. This is more than a tale of stardom or sorrow. It is the story of two individuals who discovered something everlasting in an industry skeptical of permanence. If you hold that real love never truly disappears, leave a heart below and subscribe, because the account you're going to encounter is one of Tinseltown's most enduring romances. But to grasp the weight of those final words, we must first return to the moment their journey truly started. Two spirits, separate paths long before Hollywood ever linked their names. Al Pacino and Diane Keaton inhabited vastly different worlds, yet both learned the same difficult lesson: that love can leave scars as lasting as the comfort it brings. Pacino's origins trace back to the South Bronx, an environment where want and clamor were everyday realities. Born in 1940 to a blue-collar Sicilian household, he experienced his father's departure before memories could even form. His mother, Rose, shouldered the dual burden of breadwinner and guardian, striving to provide both warmth for their home and hope for their future. Al would later reflect that cinemas were his earliest sanctuary, dim spaces where the radiant screen felt warmer than a Bronx winter. He discovered early that creativity could transform suffering into strength. The child who once drew patterns on icy window panes would one day show audiences how quiet intensity could speak volumes. Meanwhile, on the opposite coast, Diane Keaton entered the world 6 years later, bathed in California sunshine that contrasted sharply with New York's overcast skies. Yet inside her Los Angeles household, silence could feel as oppressive as poverty. Her father was a civil engineer. Her mother nurtured ambitions she herself was never permitted to fulfill. Dorothy Deanne Hall had once been honored as Mrs. Los Angeles 1955, but exchanged the stage for domesticity, trading applause for the routine of household chores. Diane witnessed that quiet sacrifice daily and vowed she would not let her own light be dimmed by expectation. If Al's youth was characterized by commotion, sirens, raised voices, the sounds of neighbors through thin walls, Diane's was defined by suppression. No one in her home shouted, but no one voiced their deepest feelings either. "We didn't discuss emotions," she would later write. "We simply existed within them." That sentiment could have described Pacino's experience as well, though his version of silence was of another kind. The stillness after conflict, the quiet before the next challenge. Both discovered meaning in what pained them. Pacino found it in the glow of the movie projector, studying each movement of performers who channeled hardship into artistry. Keaton discovered hers on school theater stages, where she could finally express herself without restraint. When she portrayed Blanche Dubois in A Streetcar Named Desire, her quivering delivery conveyed not anxiety, but raw sincerity. That role became her first passage out of suburban quietude. By the time Al was navigating New York's chilly avenues, taking odd jobs and scraping together money for acting workshops, Diane was hoarding her waitressing earnings to purchase a ticket east. Two lives journeying toward the same metropolis, propelled by the same unspoken yearning to be truly seen. He brought intensity, untamed, visceral, forged in hardship. She brought luminosity, uniquely charming, bright, emerging from self-control. Together, they would eventually create the equilibrium neither had known in youth, his turbulence eased by her compassion, her delicacy anchored by his strength. Each understood solitude too intimately to confuse acclaim with affection. Maybe that's why their eventual bond felt more significant than any screenplay. They recognized one another's hidden wounds before any confession passed their lips. Their lives demonstrate that extraordinary talent often emerges from environments lacking ease, from the drive that compels an artist to persist when circumstances turn harsh. and from the quiet that instructs another to communicate with truth rather than polish. Two separate realities, contrasting in nearly every aspect, preparing two kindred souls for an encounter that would redefine them both. And when those two wounded hearts finally met, something remarkable began. Al Pacino's formative years. The youth. Fueled by longing. Al Pacino's narrative did not open with glamour, premieres, or ovations. It started with a longing child in an unheated apartment along the unforgiving streets of the South Bronx. Born in 1940 to Sicilian immigrants, he was raised in a setting unfamiliar with luxury. His father abandoned the family early on, and his mother, Rose, labored tirelessly to provide the basics. Rent was perpetually overdue. The air in their home was persistently cold, and the nights echoed with urban unrest. Yet, within that dissonance, Al found an unexpected refuge, the local movie house. Beneath the shimmering glow of the projector beam, he experienced solace for the first time. The narratives unfolding on screen gave voice to the stillness he held inside. He observed larger-than-life expressions and understood that feeling could become its own dialect. That revelation would reshape his destiny. For Al, performing was not a fantasy, it was a means of enduring. By adolescence, life had already schooled him in loss. He took on miscellaneous work to assist his mother, hauling parcels, washing storefronts, accepting any task that would help put meals on the table. The friends he grew up with fell into the grip of addiction, the kind that consumed futures before they could even start. 3 were lost before they reached 20. Al could have easily followed, but he discovered another way out, the theater. He trained at HB Studio in New York, where his unrefined passion caught the eye of instructors who saw beyond the roughness. They saw authenticity. Performing didn't remove the hurt. It gave it purpose. Each rejection, every cold night spent beneath city lights, became kindling for the creative blaze that would one day define his career. During those lean years, he mastered the craft of perseverance. There were days without meals, nights spent in vacant theaters, pretending he'd arrived early for the next show. Yet each dawn he returned to class propelled by a force that hardship couldn't extinguish, a belief in what he was meant to be. If not for acting, he would later reflect softly, I'm not sure I would have made it. Then came his breakthrough. In 1968, a production titled The Indian Wants the Bronx altered everything. Critics were captivated by his raw portrayal. It wasn't smooth, but it was real. That genuineness would eventually draw the attention of Francis Ford Coppola, who saw not just an actor, but a contained tempest in one man. Despite resistance from the studio, Coppola took a chance and cast him as Michael Corleone in The Godfather. The movie elevated Al Pacino from a striving performer to an icon. Yet behind that triumph remained the same boy who once slept in the dark, hungry but undefeated. Every shot of The Godfather carried the gravity of his history, the quiet of his youth, the solitude of survival, the inner fire that never dimmed. Celebrity didn't mend those old wounds. It only muffled them. He learned to express himself through his roles rather than words. Michael Corleone's restraint, Tony Montana's rage, Frank Slade's wounded ego, they were all fragments of Al, reshaped through performance. He didn't realize it then, but his life of noise and resilience was about to intersect with someone from a contrasting universe, a woman who had forged her own strength from stillness. Her name was Diane Keaton, and when they encountered each other, it wasn't merely two performers on a set. It was intensity meeting illumination, yearning meeting elegance, and when those two wounded hearts connected, something unforgettable began. Diane Keaton's formative journey, the young woman who gave silence a voice. While Al Pacino's life was shaped by need and turmoil, Diane Keaton's upbringing was structured by quiet conformity. Born on January 5, 1946 in Los Angeles, she was raised amid sunshine, structure, and a stillness that felt overwhelming for a child. Her father, Jack Hall, was a civil engineer, reliable, methodical, and emotionally reserved. Her mother, Dorothy Diane Hall, had once known glamour, winning the title of Mrs. Los Angeles in 1955, yet exchanged her crown for domestic responsibility. Inside their well-kept home, everything appeared flawless, neatly ironed clothes, meals served on time, courteous smiles. But behind that image of tranquility, Diane sensed a void her family never acknowledged. Her mother's unfulfilled aspirations lingered in every room. I saw my mother diminish, Diane would later recall. Her world grew smaller and smaller until only affection and chores remained. That quiet sorrow became Diane's first act of defiance. She vowed she would not live trapped inside someone else's vision. Her rebellion wasn't loud. It was persistent, thoughtful, and full of purpose. Teachers described her as unconventional. Peers called her different. But in that uniqueness, she found herself. "If no one listens," she once remarked, "you must become the voice that echoes back." By high school, Diane had already found the stage, a faint, flickering light that pierced the silence. She performed in A Streetcar Named Desire, and when the audience applauded, it wasn't the noise she cherished. It was the sensation of finally being visible. Acting didn't just grant her a voice, it granted her liberation. At 20, she packed one suitcase and left California for New York City, pursuing the same aspiration that had once eluded her mother. She shed her surname Hall and took Keaton, her mother's maiden name, as both an homage and a pledge that she would carry forward the part of her mother that had once dreamed boldly. New York was unforgiving. She lived in cramped apartments with thin walls, worked as a server, and sang in dim basements for small change. There were evenings she couldn't afford a meal, mornings she walked miles to auditions that led to nothing. Yet even in weariness, she refused to surrender. She wrote in her diary, "Fear is my fuel. I'll burn it until there's none left." It was during those long winters and uncertain dawns that Diane built the resilience she would later be celebrated for. Quiet, sincere, and unyielding. She learned that gentleness wasn't frailty, and that honesty could outshine gloss. Years later, when recognition finally found her, she stated, "I wasn't pursuing perfection. I was pursuing truth." That truth would become her signature. The way she laughed unreservedly, dressed uniquely, and spoke with unfiltered candor in an industry fixated on facades. Her early years weren't glittering, but they were sacred. Every rejection, every chilly night, every note of her mother's unfinished melody became part of her essence. She transformed silence into a voice that would one day resonate across generations. And while she was learning to speak through her art, somewhere else in the country, a young man was learning to endure through flame. Both were marked in different ways, molded by absence and desire. And destiny, patient as always, was quietly arranging the moment their journeys would merge. And when those two wounded souls met, something extraordinary began. Quick pause. If you're still watching, it's clear this story moves you. Tap the like button to honor Diane Keaton's legacy, and let YouTube know this narrative deserves to be heard. The Godfather, where intensity met illumination. It was 1971 when two young actors, still unknown to the wider public, walked onto a softly lit soundstage in New York. The air carried a faint scent of dust and coffee, lights hummed overhead, and no one could have predicted that something historic was unfolding. Al Pacino had been chosen to play Michael Corleone, a reserved son destined to become a ruler of darkness, and Diane Keaton as Kay Adams, the woman who would love him and lose him to power. What neither realized was that the film would become more than a classic. It would mark the start of something profoundly human, a bond that blurred the boundaries between fiction and reality. From the first rehearsal, there was an energy no director could have manufactured. Diane's warmth seemed to soften Al's protective shell. His quiet depth drew her in. She joked with him between shots, trying to draw a smile from a man accustomed to concealing himself behind silence. He wasn't used to laughter, especially not hers, which emerged like sunshine in a windowless space. Crew members took note. Their chemistry wasn't staged, it simply was, living in the pauses between their dialogue. When filming began, Michael gazed at Kay with a tenderness that went far beyond the screenplay. One cinematographer later recalled, "You could sense it. The atmosphere changed when they looked at one another." After hours, they'd sit on the curb outside the studio, sharing simple meals and personal stories. Diane spoke of her mother's pageants and quiet disappointments. Al told her about sleeping in movie houses as a child and dreaming of warmth. They weren't yet lovers, just two solitary people who recognized something kindred in each other, the longing to be truly seen. The success of The Godfather changed everything. Overnight, they went from struggling artists to symbols of a new era. Their faces graced magazine covers. Critics hailed them as the heart of contemporary film. But away from the glare, their bond remained unassuming. Overcooked pasta dinners, late strolls through New York, private jokes only they understood. Diane brought levity into Al's life, and he gave her stability. She later shared, "He was enigmatic and deep. I wanted to hear him laugh." And he did, gently, cautiously, as though laughter were a treasure he didn't quite feel he deserved. For the first time, Al Pacino allowed someone to see the person behind the myth he was becoming. That is why The Godfather endures as more than a film in their story. It was the convergence of two lives shaped by opposing worlds, his tempered by fire, hers by silence, finally finding harmony. The storm met the serenity. The flame met its reflection. As fame swelled around them like a rising wave, their connection deepened in private. Love was no longer confined to the script. It had stepped off the page and into their lives. But in Hollywood, even the most sacred bonds must endure the spotlight. And soon, the very light that had united them would begin to cast shadows neither could avoid. The private love, affection away from the glare as. The Godfather became a worldwide sensation. Al Pacino and Diane Keaton found themselves at the heart of a whirlwind they hadn't anticipated. Journalists pursued them through terminals, cameras flashed in their eyes, and magazine covers anointed them as Hollywood's perfect pair. Yet behind the dazzling premieres and silver screen triumphs, their bond stayed refreshingly uncomplicated, shared, meals in quiet corners, conversations that stretched into the night, and a love that felt genuine without requiring public validation. To audiences everywhere, they represented cinematic excellence. To one another, they were simply Al and Diane, two imperfect, searching individuals who discovered peace in one another's company. When filming wrapped, their relationship flourished away from public view. They enjoyed lengthy strolls through Central Park, reading dialogue aloud just to hear the other laugh. Diane penned brief messages and tucked them into his coat pockets before he left for work. Al, never verbose, left instant photos on her pillow, small, personal tokens that said he was thinking of her. Those close to them observed how their differences created harmony. Al, serious and introspective, carried the emotional weight of every part he portrayed. Diane, whimsical and genuine, possessed the unique gift of drawing him out of his solitude. With him, I felt connected to something extraordinary, she reflected years later. But I always cherished the simple, everyday moments, the overcooked meals, the spontaneous drives, the inside jokes that belonged only to us. As reported by Newsweek, Diane Keaton even supported Al Pacino during a period of financial struggle early in his career. After The Godfather's success, Al found himself still burdened by debt and poorly represented by his attorney. The piece describes how Keaton intervened on his behalf, confronting his lawyer directly, insisting he treat Pacino justly, and ultimately rescuing him from economic collapse. It wasn't a showy declaration of love, it was devotion in its purest form. She recognized his value before the industry did, and she advocated for him when he couldn't advocate for himself. Their love wasn't performative. It lived in the subtle details, the way she straightened his collar before public appearances, the way he observed her from a distance in crowded spaces as if committing her image to memory. Even as their careers ascended, they protected their private life like something precious. To the outside world, they were the ideal on-screen pair. In truth, they were simply striving to preserve something human in a life that had become anything but. Al's existence centered on his craft. He immersed himself in parts that demanded his all: Serpico, Dog Day Afternoon, Scarface. Each role took something from him, leaving him more withdrawn every time he re-emerged. Diane saw it unfolding before he did. She loved him deeply, but she also understood she was giving her heart to a man who could retreat into his own silence for months. Still, she remained. There was the intensity about him that both scared and captivated me, she acknowledged. You can't extinguish a flame like that. You simply learn to stand near its warmth. For Al, love was both a sanctuary and a source of fear. Having spent a lifetime enduring loss, now that he had found something precious, he wasn't certain he knew how to hold on to it. His greatest dread wasn't the loss of fame, it was the loss of his own identity within love. So he gradually withdrew, not realizing how profoundly it wounded her. Yet there were still moments of serene tranquility, quiet evenings with Sinatras, Voice in the background, Diane asleep with her head on his shoulder, Al softly reciting lines from plays he never performed. In those instances, words were unnecessary. They simply coexisted, the tempest and the tranquility, the blaze and the glow. But fame is a demanding partner. It requires attention, time, and sacrifice. And as the world celebrated them, the very passion that had united them, the art they both revered, began to drive them apart. The love that once grew in seclusion was about to confront its greatest challenge under the glare of public attention: the separation that slowly formed. For almost 10 years, Al Pacino and Diane Keaton had existed in a rhythm that balanced stardom with intimacy, those quiet, in-between instants that reminded them of who they were before the world took notice. But love, even one as profound as theirs, cannot always withstand the burden of growing distance. What started as two artists finding solace in one another gradually became two lives moving in different directions. By the late 1970s, both were at the peak of their professions. Al's work consumed him, Bobby Deerfield, and Justice for All and the escalating intensity that accompanied each new part. He disappeared into characters that demanded everything he had, while Diane was evolving into a creative powerhouse with Annie Hall and Reds. The hours once reserved for late-night talks and homemade dinners were now filled with flights, film sets, and exhaustion. Diane, always open, continued reaching out through letters, long, reflective notes lightly scented with her perfume. Sometimes he replied. Sometimes he didn't. Celebrity had a way of constructing invisible barriers, and Al, who had spent a lifetime guarding himself, began hiding again within his work. He wasn't cruel, just inaccessible. She once said softly, "He would retreat somewhere deep within, and I never learned the path to follow him." For Al, love was a risk he didn't know how to navigate. The more Diane invested, the more he feared losing his footing. He admired her strength, her laughter, her faith in love, but he wasn't prepared for permanence. She wanted marriage. He desired space. Not because he didn't love her, but because he hadn't yet learned how to love without losing control of the world he had fought to build. Their ending wasn't a dramatic rupture. It was a gradual fading. Missed calls became missed weekends. Shared laughter became polite silence. Until one evening, she packed her belongings without rage, without tears, just acceptance. Standing in the doorway, she told him, "I can't keep waiting for you to fully choose me." He didn't protest. He simply stood, watching her leave, aware he had just released something irreplaceable. Years later, Al would confess in an interview, "I wasn't ready for the depth of her love. She wanted a shared life, and I was still learning how to survive my own." And Diane, with the elegance that defined her, stated, "He shattered my heart." But it wasn't his intention. Their split didn't immediately make headlines, it simply drifted into the quiet space between film releases. But when word eventually spread, fans grieved as if a great romance had ended prematurely. One publication lamented, "If Al and Diane couldn't make it, what chance do the rest of us have?" And yet they never fully vanished from each other's lives. When they encountered one another at events, the connection remained, a gaze held too long, a faint smile laden with memory. They were no longer a couple, but they never completely released each other either. For Diane, heartache became inspiration. Her performances after their parting carried a new vulnerability, one that only authentic loss can teach. For Al, the silence she left behind seeped into his roles, the passion, the control, the yearning that always lived in his eyes. Their love didn't end in betrayal or resentment. It ended the way true love often does, gently, tenderly, because the timing wasn't on their side. They were two souls destined to meet, just not to stay. And though the romance concluded, the story did not. The echo of what they shared would accompany them both, through every accolade, every role, and every hollow moment that success could not fill. And even decades later, when the world believed their story was over, destiny would bring them together one final time. The performances that held their memory after their quiet separation, both Al Pacino and Diane Keaton carried the resonance of their love into every project they undertook. What they could no longer say to one another, they expressed through their artistry. It was as if their spirits continued to meet on screen long after their hearts had chosen separate paths. For Diane, the pain of release became the emotional foundation of her most defining roles. In Annie Hall, her laughter was anxious yet authentic, the hesitations in her speech filled with unvoiced longing. Audiences saw a character, but those familiar with her story recognized truth, a woman who had loved profoundly and learned how to walk away without malice. Her performance earned her an Oscar in 1978, but even as she held the golden statuette, she later confessed she felt an emptiness. Success had arrived, but the person who once made her believe in herself was gone. Al, too, channeled his heart into his work. In Serpico and Scarface, his portrayals radiated the raw fire of someone still fighting unseen wars. The solitude that characterized his roles wasn't invented. It was experienced. Friends noted how he lost himself in work, using his characters to express what language could not. He once remarked, "Every role I take on is a concealed confession." Then, in 1990, fate brought them together again on the set of The Godfather Part III. Nearly 20 years had passed. Diane was 44, Al was 50, and time had softened edges that pain had once hardened. She later shared that seeing him again brought everything back, not romantically, but in a deeply human way. "When I looked at him," she said, "it felt like no time had passed, and yet all the time in the world had." On set, their old rhythm returned. Between takes, they laughed as they had in the 1970s, but there was also a new quiet between them, softer, wiser, and filled with what might have been. The camera captured something real once more, not acting, but remembrance. When Kay looked at Michael with quiet sorrow, it wasn't a performance. It was Diane seeing the man who had once been her forever. After filming concluded, they parted ways once again, but without regret. The connection they shared no longer required definition. It had matured into something rarer, mutual respect. They had ceased being lovers, but they had become permanent chapters in each other's lives. In subsequent interviews, both spoke with affection rather than anguish. Diane would say, "I loved him deeply. I still do, just in a different way." And Al, in his own reserved manner, conceded, "She was the one I let slip away. Their bond outlasted their romance." It became a form of artistic truth, evidence that love doesn't have to last forever to remain eternal. The chemistry between them, both on and off screen, became part of Hollywood lore. Directors noted it, co-stars admired it, and fans never stopped feeling that somewhere beneath the surface, their love endured, even if only as a beautiful echo in every scene they shared. They had loved one another as only two artists can, fully, fiercely, imperfectly. And though the world moved forward, every film they made seemed to carry a fragment of what they once shared. Because real love, once lived authentically, never truly vanishes. It simply finds new ways to endure, through memory, through art, and through the stories that keep it breathing. Quick note: before we continue, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next installment of Hollywood's most memorable love stories. Enduring respect. A connection beyond definition, as years turned into decades. Al Pacino and Diane Keaton released the need to label what they meant to one another. The romance that once burned brightly had transformed into something more subtle, an unspoken understanding that survived both passion and separation. It was no longer about clinging to the past. It was about comprehension. According to People magazine, Al Pacino and Diane Keaton first encountered each other on the set of The Godfather in the early 1970s, where their on-screen connection soon developed into a real-life relationship. People notes that their partnership was intermittent over the years, influenced by demanding schedules and differing personal goals, yet their fondness for one another never disappeared. Even after going separate ways, the publication highlights that Keaton often spoke of Pacino with warmth, describing him as a gifted, complex man, while Pacino later referred to her as the one that got away. In interviews, both reflected with a blend of nostalgia and wistfulness, like two people who had shared something too unique to ever fully articulate. Diane, ever candid, described Al with an admiration that never faded. "I loved him then, and I love him now," she once expressed. "There's no one else like him." Al, who had built a lifetime avoiding emotional display, surprised many when he finally acknowledged, "She was the one I let get away." There was no resentment in his tone, only quiet recognition, the kind that comes from loving someone enough to release them. Their friendship persisted through decades of change, through award ceremonies and the shifting lights of fame. They continued to reach out from time to time, sometimes discussing projects, other times just to hear the other's voice. When questioned about her most cherished collaborator, Diane's face would soften before she replied, "Al, it will always be Al." And he, in response, would brighten at the sound of her name, as if decades could never fade the echo of her laughter. They had come to represent a different form of love, one that didn't require ownership to be authentic. What they shared wasn't a story of loss, but a living testament. Even when love transforms, it never truly vanishes. It remains in the unspoken moments, in the spaces where two spirits connected and discovered something essential about themselves. In an industry where relationships often dissolve quicker than celebrity, theirs became a quiet myth. People still spoke of their chemistry with reverence, as though it belonged not just to two performers, but to something larger. They stood as evidence that love could outlive conclusions, evolving into admiration, respect, and a bond that defied time. By the time both had reached their 70s, they had built complete lives, separate yet forever linked. Diane continued to act and write, her presence still illuminating every space she entered. Al kept working, his performances radiating the same raw authenticity that had first drawn her near. And though they never came back together as partners, the connection between them remained sacred, like a golden thread woven invisibly through both their stories. There is a rare serenity that comes from knowing you were deeply loved, even if it wasn't forever. That serenity defined them both. Because what Al and Diane shared was never about permanence, it was about truth. And sometimes, truth endures longer than any vow ever could. The final goodbye. October 2025 on. The morning of October 11th, 2025. The world woke to news that felt almost impossible to process. According to People, Diane Keaton had passed away in California at 79. Her family shared no additional details, requesting privacy. One last, graceful boundary from a woman who had given so much of herself to the world. Word moved like a gentle tide through Hollywood. Within hours, social media overflowed with tributes from actors, directors, and fans who had grown up with her unique charm. Meryl Streep wrote, "She showed us that truth could be humorous, and that strength could be gentle." Emma Stone described her as the reason unconventional girls everywhere found courage. Film screenings paused, talk shows dimmed their lights, and even New York's Broadway theaters observed a moment of silence in her honor. It was as if the entertainment world itself had paused to breathe. But among the countless homages, one silence carried more weight than any speech: Al Pacino's. For 2 days, he said nothing. Those close to him shared that he remained inside his New York apartment, standing by the window overlooking the river, watching the early light reflect on the water. The man whose voice had filled cinemas for generations now had no words. When he finally broke his silence, it wasn't through an interview or press conference, but through a brief, emotional statement that arrived like a whisper amid the noise. "She was my friend, my light, and a part of me that time could never take. I will love her always." The words were few, but to those who knew their story, they carried a lifetime. The joy, the sorrow, the quiet moments, the passing years. It wasn't merely a farewell. It was a confession that had taken half a century to voice. At sunset, the streets outside the TCL Chinese Theater in Los Angeles began filling with fans carrying flowers, handwritten notes, and vintage photos from Annie Hall and The Godfather. Someone placed a wide-brimmed hat, her signature accessory, beside a candle. The flame flickered once, then steadied, as if refusing to be extinguished. Across the ocean, screens in Rome, London, and Paris glowed with tributes. "A timeless muse," one headline declared. Another called her Hollywood's heart in human form. But perhaps the most poignant homage came not from an actor or studio, but from a small independent cinema in the Bronx, the same borough where Al Pacino had once come of age. They projected Annie Hall onto a white brick wall, free for anyone who wished to watch. Dozens gathered in folding chairs, laughing and crying together in the cool October air. For Al, the loss was deeply personal in a way that defied explanation. He didn't attend public memorials, but friends later shared that he rewatched The Godfather alone, not as a film, but as a memory. Every scene that had once made him famous now held new meaning. The glances, the pauses, the tenderness that had never been part of the script. Those around him described his grief as quiet and profound. "He didn't weep openly," a longtime friend noted. "He just kept saying she was light, that everything she touched grew brighter." Diane Keaton had once reflected, "Love doesn't always last, but it always leaves something behind." And as her image faded from the screen one final time, those words suddenly resonated with clarity. What she left behind wasn't just a collection of unforgettable roles, it was a legacy of warmth, honesty, and the courage to be imperfect. Her laughter had reshaped how audiences viewed women in film. Her sincerity had softened the edges of fame. And in the quiet corners of Al Pacino's life, she had left something no one else ever could, a memory that would never lose its glow. That October, as film reels turned once more and the world tried to move forward, one truth stood clear. Diane Keaton hadn't simply existed in the spotlight, she had illuminated it. And though her story had reached its final chapter, the radiance she left behind was everlasting. Al Pacino's final words. In the days following Diane Keaton's passing, Al Pacino became a portrait of quiet sorrow. While Hollywood buzzed with tributes, interviews, and memorial specials, Al remained still, untouched by the commotion. For years, he had portrayed men who concealed pain behind silence, but this time, it wasn't a performance. This silence was real. When he finally spoke, it wasn't through the dramatic press releases or lengthy reflections many anticipated. It arrived as a short, handwritten note released by his publicist. "She was my friend, my light, and a part of me that time could never take. I will love her always." Those words were simple, yet to anyone familiar with their journey, they felt like a final, gentle chapter, honest and weighted with decades of unspoken emotion. It was as if every feeling he had buried since the 1970s had surfaced at once, distilled into one trembling sentence. Friends shared that Al avoided interviews and public appearances for weeks. He stayed in his apartment, where sunlight streamed through tall windows onto framed photographs lining his shelves. Among them was one of Diane, smiling, her wide-brimmed hat tilted playfully, eyes sparkling with life. He kept it near his piano. Whenever he passed it, he would pause, resting a hand gently on the frame. A close friend told The Hollywood Reporter, "He didn't say much, but when he did, it was always about her, about how she made everything feel lighter, how she found beauty in flaws." That month, he rewatched the Godfather trilogy, not for nostalgia's sake or to study his legacy, but to feel close to her again. The quiet moments between Michael and Kay, once just elements of a role, now felt like sacred fragments of a life they had lived off camera. When Michael looked at Kay with regret, it was no longer acting. It was memory. Those who had worked with both of them spoke of their connection with deep respect. Warren Beatty reflected, "They didn't just perform together, they understood one another." Meryl Streep added, "You could see it. They didn't need dialogue." And perhaps that's why his statement resonated so profoundly. It wasn't about conventional grief. It was about a love that had never truly ended, a love that had simply learned to exist quietly, awaiting one last goodbye. When asked later by a journalist if he had any regrets, Al paused for a long moment before answering. His voice wavered slightly, soft yet certain. "I believe love changes, but it never leaves. She still is." That brief exchange became one of the most revisited clips of his storied career, not because of his stature as an actor, but because of what he revealed as a man. Vulnerability, gratitude, the courage to speak softly in a world that often shouts. In those few words, Al Pacino reminded everyone of something Diane had always believed: that love, no matter how incomplete, still holds meaning. And though the cameras would eventually turn elsewhere, one truth endured: their story had never truly concluded. It had simply shifted from the screen to the spaces between memory and silence, where two souls who once met in passion now rested in peace. Because when love is real, it doesn't die. It simply finds a quieter place to reside. Final thoughts. A love that became timeless when the world finally grew still again. After the tributes faded and the screens no longer replayed her laughter, something remarkable remained: a sacred quiet. It wasn't the silence of mourning. It was the kind that follows profound truth. Because Diane Keaton and Al Pacino had never been a fairy tale. They were something more human, and ultimately more enduring. Diane once observed, Love doesn't always last, but it always leaves something behind. And she was right. What she and Al built together was proof that some bonds are too deep for endings. Their story wasn't confined by marriage or years. It was anchored by the rare understanding between two spirits who had lived, lost, and learned how to love in their own quiet way. For Al Pacino, that love became part of his artistry, the tenderness beneath his intensity, the calm within his storm. For Diane, it lived in every line she delivered, every laugh that bridged the space between words. Together, they transformed their love into something unbreakable, a legacy. In the weeks after her passing, fans returned to their films. They watched Annie Hall, The Godfather, Reds, and Looking for Mr. Goodbar not merely as cinema, but as living memories. In every glance, in every pause between Michael and Kay, they saw something beyond performance. They saw love preserved, forever glowing across time. At 85, Al Pacino continued to work, his passion undimmed. But friends noted a change in him. A new softness had emerged, a gentler patience, a reflective quiet that surfaced whenever her name was mentioned. One evening, while promoting a new project, a reporter asked what he believed love truly meant after all his years. He offered a faint smile and said, "It's what remains after everything else fades." Those who had followed their story understood. That was Diane, that was them. Their love was never about forever. It was about truth, the kind that doesn't need volume to be real. It lived in the way they looked at each other across a busy set, in the way she could make him laugh when no one else could, and in the way he still carried her memory decades later. Hollywood will remember them as icons, but those who looked closer witnessed something far rarer. Two people who found light in one another and refused to let the world dim it. Their story wasn't about tragedy. It was about transformation. From passion to friendship, from youth to memory, from heartache to peace, it became something pure. As the credits of their lives continue to roll, one truth shines through. Some loves are not meant to be lived forever. They are meant to be felt forever. And perhaps that is what makes theirs eternal. So as the world bids farewell to Diane Keaton, it mourns not just an actress. It honors a spirit, one who turned imperfection into beauty, and silence into art. And somewhere Al Pacino still carries her laughter, still feels her light in the spaces between his words, because real love never dies. It simply changes form, from touch to memory, from memory to legend, from legend to light. And that light, the one Diane left behind, still burns, softly, endlessly, in every heart she ever touched. Tell us in the comments, what's your favorite Diane Keaton moment or film? Leave a heart if you believe true love never fades. Subscribe for more stories that uncover the untold truths behind Hollywood's most unforgettable legends, because some lights, like Diane's, never go out.